This video is for those students that missed today's lesson. Today's lesson is on 11-4 two-way tables, and our learning objectives are the following. We are going to find and interpret marginal frequencies. We're going to make two-way tables, and we're going to find relative and conditional relative frequencies. So we are not going to be looking at two-way tables to recognize associations. So what we are going to do is I am going to start with some core vocabulary, and the first word that I'm going to define is going to be two-way table. So a two-way table is a frequency table. So I'm going to write is a frequency table. And it is a table where I collect data, that displays data from one source and I'm collecting it in two categories from two different categories. So let's look down at the bottom down here, and I've got an example of a two-way table, and I want to look at what are the categories. My categories are class, so freshman and sophomore class, and mobile access. And you can see that I've collected my data in a two-way table. So again, I'm going to go back and I'm going to say that it is from one source. What is the source? The source is from a high school, could be a high school, could be a college, and two different categories. What are the two different categories? Freshman and sophomore, that's the class that they're in, and whether they have mobile access or not. Okay, so that's the definition of a two-way table. The second word that we're going to look at is called joint frequency. And joint frequency is simply the data, or each entry, in other words, the data, in my two-way table. Okay, so again, if I look down here, I want you to, well, first of all, I want to point out the word joint. Joint because that is my two different categories. It's the data that I'm joining together. The frequency is simply how many times do I see, or how many times did I count something. So looking down here at my table again, here are my joint frequencies right here in my table. They're all the data values that make up the table. Okay, so now the last word that I want to cover is marginal frequency, and that's basically the sum of the rows and columns in a two-way table. In other words, they are my totals. In other words, sum is are my totals. Okay, so again, take a look down here at my table. So that would mean if I were to add 55 and 22 across, as well as add down 55 and 63, those would get my totals for my rows and columns. So that's what my my marginal frequencies are. So now let's go ahead and turn the page. I'm now on page 26, and up here at the top it says we're supposed to create our own two-way table. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually sketch one out, and I'd like you to copy it so that way you kind of do it on your own with my help and guidance. So the very first thing that I do is I draw a rectangle, and within the rectangle I'm going to cut that up into 4, because that in itself is going to represent my data. All right, so now I've got my data. But remember, I need to have the data coming from two different categories. So where do my category labels go? They go on the outside of my table. So these are my categories. So categories here, and then categories here. All right, and then obviously I have some kind of a naming convention as well. So I've got data, got my categories up here, and now I need to put in my rows and columns, my sums, the totals. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to draw some additional rectangles right there, and I am going to note that within my rectangles that I've just drawn, those are going to be my totals. So I'm going to write the word total here, and this is also a total, and this is a total, and this is a total. So where do all my totals come from? Well, they actually come from my table. So when I add my row, and I add my row this way, then I should have my totals. And the same thing follows suit with my columns. So when I add down and add down, that gives me my totals there as well. And the last piece that I want to add to this table, which is important, and it's going to be important later on in our lesson, is this square right there. So this square is my grand total. And what this represents is the total number of people, the total number of people in my survey. Okay, so there's a couple of more things I want to add to this table, and that's just to give you some more vocabulary. So we know these are our categories. This is our data. The other word for our data was joint frequency. And the totals right there, that is our marginal frequencies. So these are our marginal frequencies as well as the other totals as well. So marginal frequency, and this is also my marginal frequency here. And one of the things I talked about today in class is that if you think about the margins along the table, so these are considered my margins. They go outside of my data. So it helps me kind of remember the word margin, marginal. All right, so now if you look down here, here's just this same example, right? But now we've drawn our own, so it's given us an opportunity to draw it, see the way it looks, and now we're just going to review this. So again, data points are my joint frequencies. My categories in this case were mobile access and class. And the only thing that's missing is our marginal frequencies. We'll take a look right here. So on this table, we've extended it, and now we've put in our marginal frequencies. So you're going to notice here are my totals. So when I add 55 and 63, I get 118. When I add 22 and 12, I get 34. And when I add the row across, 55 and 22, that's 77. 63 and 12 is 75. And it kind of basically tells you what this table tells us. That obviously we were figuring out whether freshmen and sophomore have mobile access. So you can see that there were a total of 77 freshmen that responded. And out of that 77 freshmen, 55 have mobile access and 22 do not. Same thing here with sophomores. So again, you got 75 total responded. You got 63 that do, 12 do not. So then what does that 152 mean right there? That means there were 152 people who were surveyed. So what I'd like you to do right now, and you can do this after you're done watching this video, is you should go back in and you should define joint frequency, marginal frequency, and answer these 5 questions. We did that today in class. So, and I will make sure I post the answers. So moving on now to, we're going to go to page 27, and we are going to look at the practice problem right up here. Sorry about that. And you're going to notice that we've got a problem where you have some data. What did the data represent? The data had something to do with cell phones and tablet computers. And so let's go ahead and read the problem. You conduct a technology survey that you're going to publish on your school's website. What you did as part of this survey was you surveyed students in the school cafeteria about their devices, their technological devices that they own. So technology could be cell phones, it could be computers, it could be tablets. Well, in this case, according to our table here, they did tablet computers and cell phones. So the results are shown in the two-way table, and what they want you to do is find and interpret the marginal frequencies. So the 2 most important words in that text, in that passage, is the word find. So find means to calculate, so we need to do some calculating. And then the other one here was interpret. So what does interpret mean? Interpret means to describe. It means to explain what the table is telling us about. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually input all of my marginal frequencies right now. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. Just like that. And I drew my table. And so now I'm going to blow this up a little bit to make it a little bit easier to read. And I'm going to plug in my total. So all I'm going to do is add across and then add down. So I get 52 and 191. And I get 158 and 85. And when I add all of that, I didn't mean to write 83, it's 85. And when I add all of that up together, I get 243, just like that. So we are good. So now I need to interpret. What does this data table tell me? Well, the very first thing that I want to do is I want to talk about the number of students that were surveyed. So there were 243 students that were part of this survey. So I say there were 243 students surveyed. And what else can I glean from the table? Well, what else do I know? I know that if I look at just this row right here, I'm talking about cell phones. How many students own a cell phone? Well, we've got 158 students right here. 158 students own a cell phone. So I'm going to state that. 158 students own a cell phone. And if 158 students own a cell phone, how many don't? And 85 do not. What else do I know about my data? Because remember, we're looking at the marginal frequencies. So the marginal frequencies, again, just to remind you, are my totals. So I'm basically talking about the totals here. So I've talked about the total number of people that have been surveyed. I've talked about the number of students that have and who do not have a cell phone. So the only thing that's left to talk about are the students that do and do not have a tablet computer. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to state that 52 students own a tablet computer, and 191 students do not own a tablet computer. So I basically have just summarized in text format everything that's on this table. So now moving on to the next section of our notes. The next section had to do with making a two-way table. So what we're going to do is we're going to actually go in and create one right here in this white space. And we're going to use these steps to help us out. And where are we going to get our information? We're going to get our information right here. So I'm going to go ahead and read the problem. It says you conduct a survey that asks 286 students in your freshman class whether they play a musical instrument or a sport. 118 of the students play a sport and 64 of those students play an instrument. 93 of the students do not play a sport or an instrument. Wow, that's a lot of information. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to break it down and just ask some very specific questions. So I'm going to go back in here and I'm going to underline some important pieces of information. You conduct a survey that asks 286 students. Right there I'm going to underline that because I know that that's my total amount of people that have been surveyed. All right, and where does that go? I remember, so I'm going to draw my little table here, and I remember that I've got my marginal frequencies out here. These are my marginal frequencies. Remember, these are my totals. Here's my data inside. And what do I know about this box right down here? This is where my total goes in. Right here. This is the total amount. So how many kids did I survey? 286 students. All right. So now I'm going to go back in and I'm going to look at it with a little bit more detail. So you conduct a survey in your freshman class. Oh, so that's my source. My source is my freshman class. And they want to know whether I play a sport or a musical instrument. Oh, bingo. Right here, these are my categories. My categories are sport, musical instrument. And what do I want to know? I want to know whether they play a sport or a musical instrument. So I'm asking a yes-no question. So right now, I'm going to say yes and no. This is yes and no. And I'm going to draw a little rectangle right here. And what else? I want to know about the categories. So what are my two categories? Sports. And what's the other category? Musical instrument. And it doesn't matter where you put it on the table. So musical instrument, just like that. All right, so now I've got my total, I've got my categories, and now I've got to figure out my data. So I'm going to go back in and read it again. I conduct a survey that asks 286 students whether they play a sport or musical instrument. 118 of the students play a sport. Play a sport right here. How many? 118. All right, so I've got an amount right there. And it says, so 118 of the students play sport, and 64 of those students, so out of that 118 students that play a sport, 64 of those play an instrument too. So they play an instrument, it's going to go right there. All right, now I'm moving on. So now I've got two pieces of data. I'm going to read my last sentence here. It says 93 of the students do not play a sport, so they don't play a sport or an instrument. So they don't play a sport or an instrument. So no is 93 right here. All right, now I can go in and using arithmetic figure out the rest of those values of the table. So let's do the easy one. What do I add to 118 to get to 286? Or all I have to do is subtract. 286 minus 118 is 168. And now I can go this way. So I can subtract 168 and 93, and I get 75. And now I can add down. This is 9. This is 139. And now I can add this way. What do I add to 139 to get to 286? I add 147. How did I get 147? I simply subtracted these two amounts. And then the last one is this one right up here. So I got 93 and 147. So I need to get to there. That means my answer is 54. So I always just double check to make sure. If I add 118 and 168 down, I should get to 286. And when I add 139 and 147, I get to 286. So I'm good. I'm totally good right there. And so that is, I created a two-way table and I organized the results and I included the marginal frequencies. The marginal frequencies are my sums of my rows and columns. So now I'm going to move on and we're going to look at, I'm not going to do anything on this back page. So if you want to go in and jot down in your own words a summary of steps, you could do that. The one thing I want to point out down here, percent. Please remember, percent is out of 100. And I always take my number and divide it by my total amount. That's how I get my percent. And I multiply it by 100. Okay, so now let's go ahead, do the last thing here that we were supposed to do. And that is finding relative frequencies. So my relative frequencies are percentages. So I want you to underline or circle that, and I am looking for percentages. So remember, I'm going to divide something by the total amount. So I'm going to divide my data or my joint frequency by the total amount. I'm going to get a decimal number, and then I multiply that by 100. That'll give me the percent. So let's go ahead and do this. So I'm looking at my data, and I am not going to read up here. I am basically just going to read my data. And I'm noticing that I've got data that's relating to majors in a medical field, and I'm looking at juniors and seniors. So this text up here says that I've got a result of a survey that asks college-bound high school students whether they plan to major in a medical field. So we're supposed to create a two-way table that shows the joint marginal relative frequencies. So I'm going to start by noticing something. What do I need to add to this table in order for me to be able to calculate relative frequencies is I need totals. So the very first thing I'm going to do is I am going to extend the table here, and I'm going to add my totals. And I am looking for the grand total right here. This is the one I need right there. So again, remember, these are my marginal frequencies. These are my marginal frequencies and my grand total. So when I add across, I get that I have 343 total juniors. I had 337 total seniors. How many total students participated in my survey? 680. So I can also add the columns down. I got 225 and 455. And just to double check, you should always add down and add across to make sure that it works. All right, so now I'm going to add in, I'm going to draw, look at it, says we have to redraw my two-way table and add columns. We're looking for the relative frequencies. So what that means is I'm going to divide each frequency by the total number of participants in the survey. And then I'm going to, from there, I'll have decimal amounts, which will also then allow me to list my percentages. So I'm going to go ahead and sketch this out quickly. And I know that I've got juniors and seniors. And I have yes and no. And my category is major in a medical field. I'm just going to abbreviate major like that. And over here I've got juniors and seniors. And then I know that that was the class. So who did I measure? I measured juniors and seniors, and I asked them a yes-no question. So again, remember, I'm taking all of the data from here. So I am going to figure out the percentages. So how do I do that? I'm going to take each frequency, so 124, and I'm going to divide that by the total number of people in the survey, 680. And I'm going to do that for each frequency here. So 101 over 680, 219 over 680, and 236 over 680. So now I'm going to take out my calculator and I'm going to calculate the decimal amounts of each one of those. And I know that this is 0.18, this is 0.15, this is 0.32, and this is 0.35. Okay, so I've got all those values in. Now I'm going to add across and add down. When I add my decimals down, I get 0.33. When I add these decimals down, I get 0.67. When I add these across, I get 0.5 and 0.5. Okay, so now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back in and I'm going to actually put percentages. So I know 0.18 is 18%. I know 0.15 is 15%. 0.33 is 33%. 0.67 is 67%. 0.35 is 35%. And I've got 32%. And then I've got 50% and 50%. So now I'm just going to add up everything down here. And when I add up all the percents, 33 and 67, that's 100. 50 and 50, that's 100. So the percent's always equal to 100%. And what do you think the decimal's going to add to? If I add 0.33 and 0.67, well, that adds to 1. And if I add 0.5 and 0.5, that also adds to 1. So the beauty is that your percents always add to 100% and your decimals always add to 1. So that is today's lesson. So if you weren't here, that's what you missed. Hopefully you were able to get all that information down. Your homework is posted online. So now based on that, you should be able to do it without any issues. Please make sure you see me if you have any questions.